The problem wasn't the cherries. The problem was their size. At least according to everyone else. Margaret Hale stood inside the county fruit co-op, holding a crate of deep red cherries, while Grant Mercer flipped through grading standards. Then sighed. Never a good sign. Margaret already knew that sigh. Farmers learned quickly. Good news rarely arrived wearing that expression. Grant picked up a cherry, turned it over, measured it against a grading template, then set it back down. Silence. Long silence. Finally, Margaret. She folded her arms. What? Grant looked genuinely uncomfortable, which somehow made things worse. These won't grade. Silence. Absolute silence. Margaret stared. What do you mean they won't grade? Grant picked up another cherry. Too small. Long pause. Then, they taste fine. Grant nodded. Yes. They look healthy. Yes. They aren't damaged. No. Silence. Then, so what's wrong with them? Grant held up the grading sheet. Size. The answer followed her all the way home. Because it sounded ridiculous. Not incorrect. Just ridiculous. The cherries tasted exceptional. Every person who sampled them agreed. Yet apparently several millimeters determined whether they mattered. That bothered her. A lot. The Hale orchard sat on rolling Missouri hills where most growers planted commercial sweet cherries. Large fruit. Uniform color. Consistent appearance. Everything designed for fresh market buyers. Margaret's orchard looked different. Very different. The trees originally came from her grandfather Samuel Hale, a stubborn man with an unfortunate habit of asking questions nobody else asked. One summer evening, when Margaret was 13, she followed him through the orchard carrying harvest buckets. The trees bent beneath heavy fruit. Not large fruit, just abundant fruit. Samuel stopped beside an older row, picked a cherry, then handed it to her. Try it. Margaret bit into it. The flavor exploded immediately. Rich, sweet, complex. Nothing like grocery store cherries. She frowned. That's good. Samuel smiled. Yes. Long pause. Then why don't stores sell these? Samuel looked across the orchard, then shrugged. Because stores sell appearances. That answer stayed with her. Because over time she noticed something. Markets often rewarded what looked good, not necessarily what tasted good. The distinction mattered. Years later, after Samuel passed away, Margaret inherited the orchard, along with decades of notebooks. Harvest records, weather notes, grafting experiments, everything. One variety appeared repeatedly throughout Samuel's records. A small fruited cherry line he'd spent years preserving. Flavor exceptional. Yield reliable. Market difficult. The phrase appeared over and over. Market difficult. Most growers would have seen a warning. Margaret saw potential, so she kept the trees. The county immediately decided she'd made a mistake. Naturally. At the diner, Dale Harper created material instantly. Good news, everybody. Rick Harlow looked up. What? Margaret's growing bird food. Laughter spread through the room. Margaret kept drinking coffee, ignoring them, mostly, but privately. The comments bothered her. Because orchards require patience. Years of patience. Nobody enjoys hearing that years of effort produced bird food. The first few harvests remained frustrating. The trees performed beautifully. The fruit tasted remarkable. Customers loved it. Yet larger buyers remained uninterested. Every conversation eventually reached the same conclusion. Too small. Too small. Too small. The words followed her everywhere. One autumn evening, Emily Hale sat across from her at the kitchen table. Production records covered every available surface. Yield reports. Packing records. Sales summaries. Everything. Emily looked around. You're doing it again. Margaret looked up. What? The papers. Silence. The papers? That means you're thinking. Long pause. Then. Yes. Emily sighed. Dangerous. Very dangerous. What kind of thinking? Margaret pointed toward the records. Cherries. Emily immediately looked nervous. Because cherry thinking usually ended with experiments. And experiments usually cost money. Bad cherry thinking? Margaret smiled slightly. Maybe. The next season produced the largest harvest yet, which somehow made everything worse. Because now she possessed even more fruit nobody wanted. At least according to conventional buyers. One morning, she loaded sample crates and drove back to the co-op. Mostly because she hoped something had changed. It hadn't. Grant Mercer looked at the cherries, then looked at Margaret, then sighed. Again. Still too small. Silence. Margaret stared. Seriously? Grant nodded. Yes. Long pause. Then, what do I do with them? The answer arrived immediately. Processing. Margaret frowned. Processing. Grant nodded. Juice. Concentrate. Industrial use. Then he shrugged. Waste stream if necessary. Silence. Absolute silence. Margaret blinked. Waste. Grant looked uncomfortable. Not literally. Long pause. Mostly. The drive home felt twice as long. Waste. Bird food. Processing grade. The labels piled up. Years of careful work reduced to categories created by people who never tasted the fruit. That evening Margaret stood beneath the trees watching wind move through leaves. The orchard looked beautiful. Heavy fruit glowed beneath sunset light. Emily found her there. You okay? Margaret laughed once. Not because anything felt funny. Because otherwise she might have been angry. The co-op thinks I grew industrial waste. Silence. Emily blinked. What? Processing grade. Long pause. Then, that might be the dumbest thing I've heard this month. Margaret looked toward the orchard, then shrugged. Maybe, but privately. Doubt arrived. Because buyers weren't exactly lining up. A few roadside sales helped. Local customers bought some. Restaurants purchased limited quantities. Nothing substantial. Nothing enough. Months passed. Then another season. Then another. The cherries remained excellent. The market remained disappointing. One July morning Margaret stood beside stacked harvest bins wondering whether everyone else had been right all along. Then she heard a truck. Not local. Definitely not local. A dark delivery truck rolled slowly down the orchard lane. Out-of-state plates. Road dust covered the sides. The vehicle looked like it had traveled a very long way. It stopped beside the loading area. A man climbed out. Tall. Silver-haired. Travel-worn. He looked exhausted. Like he'd spent the entire day behind a steering wheel. Then he looked toward the cherry bins. And smiled. A real smile. Not the polite kind. Not the business kind. The kind people make when they've finally found exactly what they were searching for. He walked toward Margaret. Extended his hand. My name's Henry Lawson. Margaret shook it. Nice to meet you. Henry picked up a cherry. Examined it carefully. Then tasted it. His eyes widened immediately. He ate another. Then looked back at her. And asked a question nobody at the co-op had ever asked. Do you have more of these? Margaret stared at him for several seconds. Because nobody had ever asked that question before. Not once. The co-op asked size. Buyers asked grading standards. Processors asked volume. Nobody asked whether she had more. Henry noticed her expression. Then smiled. Is that a strange question? Margaret laughed softly. A little. He looked toward the stacked harvest bins. Rows of them. Filled with deep red cherries. Then back at her. How many acres? Margaret answered. Henry nodded slowly. Then smiled again. Good. Long pause. Then. Good. Yes. He picked up another cherry. Bit into it. Then another. Margaret watched. Because most buyers sampled one fruit. Maybe two. Henry was on his sixth. That seemed unusual. Finally she folded her arms. So what exactly do you do? Henry smiled. Brandy. Silence. Then. Brandy. He nodded. Craft fruit brandy. Long pause. Then. And you drove all this way for cherries? Henry laughed. Not cherries. He held one up. These cherries. That answer stayed with her. Because nobody had ever spoken about the fruit that way. Not once. The next several hours disappeared. Henry walked through the orchard. Examined trees. Sampled fruit from different rows. Asked questions about soil. Rainfall. Rootstock. Harvest timing. Everything. At one point, he simply stood beneath a tree eating cherries while taking notes. Emily looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back. Neither knew what to make of it. Finally, Margaret asked, What makes these so special? Henry pointed toward a cherry. Flavor concentration. Silence. Then, meaning, he smiled. Everybody else sees small fruit. Margaret nodded. Yes. I see less water. Long pause. Then, what? Henry picked up two cherries. One of hers. One from a commercial sample he brought with him. He cut them open. Then pointed. Large fruit often means more water. He tapped hers. These are concentrated. Another pause. More sugar. More aroma. More character. Margaret stared. Because nobody at the co-op had ever said anything remotely similar. The co-op measured diameter. Henry measured flavor. The distinction mattered. That evening Henry stayed for supper. Afterward they sat on the porch overlooking the orchard. The sunset painted the hills gold. Henry leaned back. Do you know what your problem is? Margaret laughed. Apparently, everybody does. He pointed toward the orchard. You've been talking to produce buyers. Silence. Then. So. Produce buyers sell appearance. The answer lingered. Because it sounded exactly like something Samuel would have said. Henry continued. They want uniformity. They want visual appeal. They want shelves. He picked up another cherry. I want flavor. The next morning, he loaded coolers with samples. Then handed Margaret a business card. Give me 3 weeks. She frowned. For what? Henry smiled. To prove something. Then he drove away. The county loved the story. Naturally. At the diner, Dale nearly spilled coffee. A brandy maker? Margaret nodded. Yes. Silence. Then. No. Yes. No. Yes. Rick looked over. You expect us to believe somebody drove 8 hours for processing cherries? Margaret shrugged. Doesn't matter. What? He already drove. That answer irritated Dale immediately. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. Then 5. Nothing. No calls. No letters. No contracts. By the 6th week, Margaret started feeling foolish. Maybe Henry simply enjoyed fruit. Maybe the county had been right all along. Maybe everyone had been right. One evening, she stood beneath the orchard watching sunlight fade across the hills. Emily walked over. You thinking? Margaret nodded. Yes. Bad thinking. Long pause. Maybe. Then headlights appeared at the end of the lane. A familiar truck rolled slowly toward the farm. Emily sat up immediately. Margaret stood. The truck stopped. Henry climbed out carrying a thick folder. And unlike last time, he wasn't smiling. That worried Margaret immediately. Because people usually smile when bringing good news. Henry walked toward her, then suddenly burst out laughing. A huge laugh. The kind people make when they're genuinely excited. You have any idea what you've grown? Margaret blinked. Cherries. Henry shook his head. No. He spread papers across the truck hood. Laboratory analyses. Fermentation reports. Distillation notes. Flavor evaluations. Production projections. Page after page. Henry pointed to one report. Exceptional sugar concentration. Another. Outstanding aroma retention. Another. Remarkable distillation character. Margaret stared. Because none of those words meant much to her. Henry noticed. Then simplified. Your cherries make extraordinary brandy. Silence. Then. Oh. Henry laughed again. That all you've got? Margaret shrugged. I don't know anything about brandy. Fair. Then he handed her a contract. She looked down. Read the numbers. Stopped. Read them again. Then again. Because surely she'd misunderstood. Surely. This can't be right. Henry smiled. It is. Silence. 3 times. Yes. Long pause. 3 times processing prices. Henry nodded. Yes. Every bushel. Yes. More silence. Then. You want all of it. Henry smiled. If you'll sell it. Emily nearly dropped the paperwork. Margaret simply stood there. Because the offer wasn't good. It wasn't even excellent. It was transformative. The words processing grade disappeared instantly. Completely. Gone. The first shipment left 2 weeks later. Then another. Then another. Refrigerated trucks rolled into the orchard and loaded every harvest bin she could fill. People noticed immediately. Of course they did. Because unfamiliar trucks arriving repeatedly at a farm everyone mocked tends to attract attention. At the co-op, conversations changed quickly. Who's buying her cherries? Some brandy company. Paying premium prices. No way. Yes way. Grant Mercer hated every minute of it. Especially when Henry walked into the co-op one afternoon. The room fell silent. Grant looked up. Yes. Henry smiled politely. You're the man who called those cherries processing waste. Silence. Nobody moved. Grant shifted uncomfortably. Well, Henry nodded. I wanted to thank you. Grant blinked. Thank me. Henry smiled wider. Yes. Long pause. Why? Henry looked around the room, then pointed toward the Hale orchard beyond town. Because if everybody understood their value. He shrugged. I never would have gotten them. Nobody laughed. Not one person. 5 years later, the orchard doubled, then expanded again. Other specialty buyers appeared. Preserve makers. Artisan beverage producers. Premium food companies. The same cherries everyone dismissed became one of the most sought-after specialty crops in the region.